Do your showcase reels often look boring like this? Well, in this particular video, we're going to up it and create cinematic looking show reels just like this in 5 simple steps. We're going to make a simple procedure that you can apply to any of the objects that you model or you want to showcase. We're going to teach 5 principles of making things more cinematic, and we'll show you what the outcome looks at every single stage. So without any further ado, let's start. The initial file that we have right now, which was a normal show reel, is a camera in the vertical aspect ratio, because that's how reels are nowadays, which is parented to an empty. The empty has 3 keyframes that allows the camera to go through 1 full rotation in the time given. We have a keyframe in the middle as well, which is not necessary, but we'll be using that keyframe later on, so we're gonna keep it just as is. So with that, let's move into step number 1, which is reorientation. The first thing to make objects seem more dramatic is by changing the orientation and not having them flat against the camera. But remember, when you do this, since the camera is moving around the empty, the center of the object should also be placed wherever the empty is, such that the object remains in focus throughout the entire 360 that the camera does around the object. Sometimes you can have a little bit of trial and error to see what angle suits your particular composition. With reorientation, this is what we have. Already looks a lot more interesting than the boring front-on view of the book. Now we can move on to step 2, which is adjusting the focal length. Focal length determines the field of view of the camera. That means that with smaller focal lengths, we can actually see much more. However, this causes a fisheye effect, and squares refrain from being square, and a bit of distortion occurs. However, there are a few cinematic focal lengths, some of which are 24 or 18 millimeters, while the default in Blender is 50. When we change to 18 millimeters, since we have a larger field of view, it feels like we're zoomed out, so we have to zoom in a bit more. And with that small change, we actually get this render, which increases the dramaticness of the video by itself. Now we can move on to step 3, which is graph editing. This is what differentiates beginners from professionals, as this small change makes the whole difference. Right now, if you hit T on the timeline, you can see the interpolation is linear. If we change it to Bezier, then we can see that it's going to start slow, speed up in the middle, and then slow down at the end. However, Bezier is much more than that, because we actually have full control over which areas go fast and which areas go slow. For that, we have to change to the graph editor. Now, in the graph editor, you can zoom in or change the size scaling by holding Control and the middle mouse button. However, you get every single one of the keyframes to show up. We don't need most of the channels, as the only keyframes that we have changed is our Z rotation. So you can keep the Z rotation and see the different keyframes, and each keyframe comes with 2 handles. Now, by just changing those handles, you can see how we change the value in which the Z location is going to change. So by making that one flat, we see that it slows down in that front orientation. Now, if we want to change one side more than the other, like in this case, we want it to be much smoother as it comes in and a lot harsher as it moves out, we can just select that side of the handle and increase it to make it much smoother. Now, this often takes a little bit of playtime to figure out what exactly you want. And for us, we want it to start really, really fast. So we're going to select the first handle and turn it at 60 degrees so that it starts off moving really fast. And in order to make it a nice loop, we have to make sure that it ends fast as well. So we turn the last handle by 60 degrees, just as shown. So now we have it such that it starts fast, it slows down in the middle, and then it becomes fast once again. However, when it slows down, we don't want it to become completely flat, which implies that it would stop moving. So we can rotate the entire central handle by a little bit so that it always has some motion, even though slower. Now you can play around with it And sometimes, like in this particular case, we realized that we still needed to go out much faster. And the only way we could do that is by decreasing the length of the animation and having the final out frame as 2 seconds rather than at 3 seconds. And therefore, we get exactly the type of animation we want. So we have to change the length of the animation from 3 seconds at 90 frames to only 2 seconds at 60 frames. So now that we've made the changes, we can go back to the graph editor and just make sure that we have a perfectly looping animation where the speed changes exactly how we want it to be. So when it's actually showing the front face, it goes slow, and the entire back is done much faster. With that, we have this particular animation. Now we can move on to step 4, which is the lighting. So the lighting is like a secret sauce that helps change the entire feel or the effect of whatever you're trying to show. So right now, everything is lit from the background, which is a simple gray light. There aren't too many shadows being formed. Now, of course, the example that we've used here is a simple book, and there isn't any shadows to be formed anyway. But even without the use of shadows, just by changing the lights, we can actually create something much more cinematic and much more dramatic than before. But lighting requires its own video, if not an entire series about it, because there are so many types of lights. Blender offers 4 different lights, and you can use them as different types of lights, like a key light, a rim light, backlight, and so on. There are types of lighting techniques like 3-point lights and so on and so forth that we would like to go into more detail, so we will get into that in a different video altogether. But till then, since we now have lights lighting up our book from all different sides, we can change the background a bit lower, and this is what we get. Now we move on to the last step, which is volumetrics. In this particular example, we've used volumetrics as the final step. But honestly, it could be anything that helps make the entire animation more cinematic. So in this case, we've used volumetrics, but we could have used different particles that act like dust. We could have changed the camera to have a different depth of field such that things nearby and far away blur out. And we could add in some type of motion blur and things like that, some type of post-processing as well, to make all of it look a lot more cinematic. But for this particular scene, we've gone ahead and used only volumetrics. Maybe we'll have another video just for step 5 to show how we can add in a lot more things to make something go from plain to something that looks like it's taken a lot of time to animate. However, in this particular scene, with the volumetrics, we wanted some type of God ray, so we've added in a spotlight. And since we already have the lighting done to our liking, in the God ray, or whatever light, the spotlight that was producing the God rays, we switched off the diffuse and specular effect of the light so that it affects only the volume. And similarly, once we do that, we go to the other light sources and reduce the volume effect of it so that they don't affect the volumetrics in the scene. So we get the lighting and the volumetrics, and this is what it looks like. Finally, once you have that set up, you can actually swap items really easily. So in this particular example, we had a different scene where we had a few items that were already present, like this particular knife thing. So once you import it into your particular scene, however you choose to do that, you have to make sure that you keep the origin or the centermost point of that object at the same center where the empty around which the camera is rotating is present. And that way, you can just change the colors appropriately of the lights, and there you go. You get this really nice rim light effect or the specular effect for shiny objects if you have the lighting set up correctly. And you can use it for any type of object just like this. So hopefully you got an understanding of how you can create different objects and how the lighting can actually affect the scene and how you can add in volumetrics to make something look a lot cooler. So hope you can make something cool out of this and stay creative. All the best.